Hey everyone, this is another BookTube channel, and you can't be a BookTube channel without posting about the worst books you read in the year. Now, I don't usually have a lot to talk about in terms of worst books I've read because I will DNF a book if I'm not enjoying it. I know there's a stigma for some people in DNFing a book about how do you know you really didn't like it if you didn't give it a chance? I think the moment you pick up a book, you are giving it a chance. And if you're not vibing with it, don't be afraid to put it down. Life is relatively short, and reading is supposed to be fun. So if you're not having fun reading what you're reading, find something else to read. Now, that's not to say that I DNF every book that I'm not enjoying right away. If I'm lukewarm on a book in the first, quarter or half, if the book is short or if it's maybe got a good author that I trust, I will still see it through to the end and, maybe it'll redeem itself. Overall, if a book's not catching me right up front, I will DNF it. This list right here is going to be a mixture of the two. It's going to be the 5 books that I DNF'd this year, as well as the 5 books that I consider to be my most disappointing books of the year. So with that being said, let's get into the list. Okay, so we're going to kick off with the DNFs. DNF, if you don't know, stands for did not finish. And some of these might be a bit controversial to some fandoms. We're going to start off with one that might make some sci-fi fans pretty upset, and that is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Look, I appreciate that this book has historical significance for being one of the first to include non-gendered or gender-fluid characters, and I appreciate that. I understand that that is a milestone. I appreciate that this book is still in print and is considered a classic, which means that the people who need to read a book like this have it out there to read it. But for me, the story was just way too difficult to get into. When it comes to sci-fi, you kind of have to expect that when you're getting into it, you have to learn a bit of a new vocabulary. That kind of comes with the territory. But for this book, the vocabulary was very, very difficult to keep track of, and I truly felt lost reading pretty much every sentence here. It's the type of sci-fi that non-sci-fi fans make fun of, where it's like, Jlorto ambled down to his Whizcrang for a glorp. The transfundiation was only a semkle away, and he had not yet prepared his frangie. Like, what? I'm not exaggerating that much. Like, that's how I would feel. That nonsense I just said to you, and you being like, what's he talking about? That's how I felt reading this book. It just, instead of pulling me into the story and the world, every sentence just made me laugh and go, what the hell is going on here? And it completely took me out of it, which is the opposite of what you want in a book, especially one that's supposed to be immersing you in a new world. After about 50 pages, maybe a little bit more, I ended up DNFing this one because I knew it wasn't going to work out. I accept the contract of needing to learn a new language when reading a sci-fi book, but the book needs to be interesting enough that you want to stick around and learn that language, and The Left Hand of Darkness just wasn't that interesting to me. The next book that I DNF'd was The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This was a book that really baffled me. I was really hoping to enjoy it. The history behind it seemed pretty cool. It's a magical realism novel set in the Soviet Union, written in the Soviet Union during the height of Stalin's reign. It wasn't published until 1966 in some capacity, and then fully published until 67. I really wanted to like it, and I kind of was into it in the beginning, but ultimately, I think my issue here was the translation. I read the Penguin 50th Anniversary Edition. It had really nice paper, it had a really great cover. I assumed that the translation would be matching the quality of those things, but I really struggled here. I don't speak it, but I took 3 years of Russian in school, so I know that to translate from Russian to English, it's not an exact one-to-one. You have to fill in a few blanks and change the grammar up a little bit. And I wonder if the translator of this edition just didn't do that. Like, I think maybe they tried to keep the English as close to the Russian as it's written as possible, but the result there is just a really clunky mess that made it very difficult to follow pretty basic actions. I didn't know what was happening from a scene-to-scene basis. I couldn't even get a sense of the setting, really, because it it was so hard to follow. So really unfortunate that maybe the translation was what was keeping me from enjoying this classic work, but ultimately I DNF'd it because it wasn't getting any better and I wasn't really enjoying myself. So that one I chalk up to an iffy translation, but this next book that I DNF'd does not have that excuse. I think this book just sucked. It is The Amityville Horror by Jay Anson. This is the completely fake, true story of the Lutz family who moved into a home in Amityville, New York, and they claim to have been tormented by like a threatening spirit in the home or just threatened by the house itself. It definitely wasn't just George Lutz being a terrible father. This is one of the worst horror novels I have ever read. Even at the time this was published in 1977, this book just feels incredibly dated to me. It kind of feels like someone prompted Jay Anson on the spot, like, okay, write a haunted house novel now. Go! And he was just fumbling like, well, the statue that normally is on the bookshelf, it was in the middle of the floor. Ooh! You know, like a lot of that type of horror. There is absolutely no successful attempt at suspense here, and the scares are so lame, I honestly felt embarrassed reading this book. Something that really bugged me was in the actual text, every scary moment is punctuated by an exclamation point. Like literally, she walked into the bedroom and then the door closed on its own with the exclamation point at the end, like Goosebumps level cheesy scare stuff. You know, it works for a kid's book like Goosebumps, but for something like this, it was just embarrassing, cheesy, low effort type of writing, and I did not like it at all, and I could not finish it. Quick aside here, I've actually been inside the Amityville Horror House. I had dinner with the owners at the time. They were lovely people. The house was wonderful. They never had any supernatural experiences whatsoever. Just wanted to throw that in there. This next DNF might upset fans of classic literature, and I am sorry. I was enjoying it for a little while. I just couldn't stick with it. It didn't really appeal to me. And that is 100 Days of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I tried really hard on this one. This is a magical realist story. It is about the Buendia family and their patriarch, Jose Arcadio Buendia, who founds a fictional town in the novel. And the book is just, I guess, about the generations of the family living in that town. It's probably the best way I could describe it, considering how far I got. I was enjoying it for a little while, but it's once the family tree started to grow and get more complicated that I kind of turned off here. I found it easier to follow the family tree of the Targaryens in Game of Thrones than the Buendia family here. I am a plot-driven reader. I admit this up front. So when things started to slow down here and focus more on just the expansion of the family tree and little vignette stories about them to introduce them or just what kind of happens to them, that's where my attention started to falter. And eventually I reached a point where I was looking for excuses to do anything but read this book, and it's right about that time that I realize it's just not going to happen and it's time to DNF it. And I really didn't want to DNF this one because I've heard such great things about it, and I was sort of into it. I just couldn't keep track of all of the Arcadios and the Jose's and the Buendias, and it got out of hand and I lost focus on it. Of the books on this list, this is the one that I am most likely to try again in the future. Probably not anytime soon, but perhaps. My final DNF of the year is The Witches of Eastwick by John Updike. I don't have a lot to say about this one because this book holds the distinction of being the fastest I have ever DNF'd a book. I only got 30 pages into this one. I immediately hated the writing. I had no interest in what was being set up, no interest in the characters. I could not care less about what was happening here. I put the book down after 30 pages, gave myself a break, I picked it back up, and in a sign of physical protest, my eyes glazed over and refused to unfocus until I put the book back down. So this was a really quick one. I do not recommend it. Okay, so we're done with the DNFs. Let's move on to the books that I actually finished this year and were disappointed by. And this first one is probably my biggest letdown of the year because I love this author so much. It is The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. Not to sound elitist, but I did actually like Paul Tremblay before it was cool. Literally, I worked at Barnes & Noble and an advanced reader copy for A Head Full of Ghosts came in. So I brought that home and I got to read that book before the general public did. And it immediately rocketed to the top of my just top books of all time. And he immediately became an auto-buy author for me. I don't have a lot of auto-buy authors. In fact, I don't have any other than Paul Tremblay. I don't auto-buy Stephen King. I don't auto-buy Brandon Sanderson. I auto-buy Paul Tremblay only. So I was extremely disappointed by the Pallbearers Club when I failed to connect to it at all. It is a coming-of-age story, I believe partly autobiographical. I know that it's at least inspired by some of Tremblay's adolescent experiences, particularly with his spine issues. It's about a young man who befriends a mysterious, maybe ageless girl who maybe is a vampire, maybe? This book is full of Tremblay's trademark ambiguity and yet another unreliable narrator, but the problem here is that the mystery surrounding the narrator is not that interesting. I genuinely don't know what tone this book was going for. If it was trying to be horror, it fell completely flat and failed to generate any sense of suspense whatsoever. There is no clear sense of danger here. There's no imminent threat. So all of the ambiguity surrounding emotional vampires is empty and frustrating. The book also wasn't funny, and it wasn't a thriller. It just wasn't anything. I don't know what the book was trying to do, with the exception of a very short piece in which the character laments about his history with his dying mother. There really wasn't even much emotion here. I just didn't get it. There's a lot of attention paid to music in this book. It's a huge part of the main character's life, and at a certain point, about halfway through, when I wasn't really feeling it, I stopped and I said, let me listen to some of this music. Maybe it'll put me in the right frame of mind. It'll put me in the character's shoes a little bit. So I opened Spotify and I planned to listen to the top 10 songs of the band Husker Du, or Husker Du, I don't know. And I only got through the first few seconds of a handful of songs. So not only did I not enjoy this book, I've also learned that I hate the band Husker Du. Next up on my list of disappointments is Hangs a Man by Shirley Jackson. I absolutely love The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Jackson. I think that those books absolutely live up to their classic status, so my expectations for Hangs a Man were pretty high, despite it being relatively unknown compared to those other works. Hangs a Man is also a coming-of-age book, so maybe I just don't like coming-of-age books, about Natalie Waits, a college-bound girl who is happy to leave home and get away from her pretentious and overbearing father and her just generally unhappy, kind of drunk mother. At college, she is relegated to the fringes of social acceptance, and she's generally disillusioned by the similarities to her home life that she observes, and she uses fantasy to escape that. I was into Hangs a Man for about halfway until it became really just too dense to enjoy, and it just wore me down. My beautiful and intelligent wife Diana also read the book, and she described it as word salad at a certain point, and I am inclined to agree. Hangs a Man lacks the punchiness of Jackson's other classics, and ultimately just feels bogged down by some needlessly tough prose. Next up is a book that I do think is good, but I expected to like it a lot more than I did, and that is The Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin. The Three Body Problem deals with Earth's first contacts with extraterrestrial life and the fallout that follows that. There are some really cool ideas in here. For instance, I like the idea of the people that know about the aliens kind of breaking into factions because they all have different ideas of what the aliens should do when they get here. There are the people who just want humanity to be wiped out completely. There are those who want to help the aliens get back to their home world and fix the issue that's facing them. There are some who are a little bit in between. That's all really interesting in theory. There was just something here that made it feel really sterile, and I just didn't find myself loving it as much as I thought I would. There really isn't a single thing in the book that I can point to and say, this is why I didn't like it, or this is why it doesn't work. I just think that it underwhelmed me, and because of that, I kind of rank it pretty low on my list for the year. Moving on to the next disappointing book, this one may upset some hardcore fantasy fans. I am sorry, again, I tried to like this one, but Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb just really did not grab me. This is a book about a bastard of royal descent who is basically taken by the royal assassin to be trained to replace him someday. It's an interesting concept, but I mentioned before, I'm a bit of a plot-driven reader, and there really isn't much plot in this book. It is very much just about Fitz growing up, I guess again a coming-of-age story, so there's something about me that I'm finding out. And the book primarily just seems to be about the author torturing the main character Fitz, and from what I hear, that kind of continues through the rest of the Farseer trilogy, so I don't want to read the rest of the Farseer trilogy. This was one of 2 fantasy series that I began in 2022 that underwhelmed me. The other one was the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I read The Blade itself, and that one I thought was good, which is why it's not on this list, and I do want to continue that series, but Assassin's Apprentice killed the Farseer trilogy on the spot for me. And now we come to the last book on my list of disappointments, and of all of the ones that I named here, even The Witches of Eastwick, which I DNF'd after 30 pages, this one might be the one that I hate the most, and that is Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Caw. I hated this book. If it weren't for the fact that the book was only about 120 pages long, I absolutely would have DNF'd it, and I would have probably just thrown it directly in the garbage. Instead, I finished it, and then I threw it directly in the garbage. This book feels like somebody with no talent is trying to write their own Haunting of Hill House, but they set it in Japan, and they only wrote it using words from a thesaurus. I'm not even going to go a little bit into the plot here, because you might accidentally find it a little bit interesting and think, oh, maybe I'll give it a shot, maybe I'll like it. No, don't do it to yourself. It's got a spooky name, it's got a spooky cover, maybe you've even seen it on the bookshelf at the store, and you've thought, ooh, you know, maybe. Once or twice you think about, oh, maybe I'll bring it home today. I'll check it out, it's kind of short. No, don't waste your money, don't waste your time. There's so many other books. Look at all these other books you could read instead. Any of them, any of these, read them instead. Annoying characters, pretentious writing, just a total misfire from top to bottom. Avoid it at all costs. Sorry to get so negative there. I am aware that if I tried to write a book, it would most likely suck. But hey, that's why I haven't tried to write a book. Know your limitations, people. If you've read and enjoyed any of these books, that's great. Media is subjective, and we should all learn from each other because everyone has a different perspective about everything that's out there. Leave a comment below to tell me what your thoughts are on these books, because I'm not the smartest person in the world. Maybe I missed something, maybe you can inspire me or encourage me to try it again. Thank you for spending some time with me today, but for now, it's time to get back to reading.